In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, hey there, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. And this is the show dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but have the confidence to rock retirement. And it's the last installment of this month-long series on understanding the fundamentals of planning for a great retirement, so you can go from theory to practice to mastery. And today we're going to talk about optimizing your retirement plan. I have a lot of thoughts on that, but I think we always want to hold on to Dwight D. Eisenhower's quote about the plan is not the important thing. It's that process, that practice of planning that is critical, because you're not going to figure all this out. And although that is a little uncomfortable, because before you give up your income, you want to have it figured all out, or before you spend this amount of money, you want to know that it will truly be okay. That's reasonable, but unrealistic. And it's the practice of planning and being agile that is going to help you have the confidence so you can correct course along the way. With that, let's go talk about how do we optimize this resilient or feasible and resilient plan so you can go rock retirement. This show is sponsored by LTCI Partners, the insurance brokerage that focuses on long-term care solutions. Long-term care is one of those difficult things. One, it can be difficult to know whether you even qualify for it and how much it will cost. But if you go to ltcipartners.com/RAM and click Get a Quote, you can fill out a questionnaire that will help determine whether it's even feasible to acquire long-term care based on some very high-level medical profile information. And then once you submit that, they will send you examples of quotes from traditional policies and hybrid policies so you can gain some more information for how you might manage this risk. So you can check that out at ltcipartners.com/RAM. Early last week, I wrote an article for Forbes Online titled, "Stop Trying to Optimize Your Retirement Plan." And today we're going to talk about optimizing your retirement plan. Let me explain. Well, I'll explain this too, because I'm wearing a brand new t-shirt, which I created, it says, "Retirement is not a spreadsheet." And one reason why I'm wearing this shirt, and one reason why I wrote an article titled "Stop Trying to Optimize Your Retirement Plan" is that tends to be the focus of, let's look at the spreadsheets. Let's optimize. What are the cool Roth strategies I can do? Let me check out the flexible dynamic withdrawal strategy and all these other things. That tends to be where we all focus. And it tends to be what everybody actually writes about because it's the bling of financial planning. And that's fine to a point. I love spreadsheets. I love optimizing plans. But what I find myself playing the role of is bringing people back to starting at the beginning of the road and not allowing ourselves to focus on optimization and not creating a plan that is focused on actually achieving life outcomes. And so I find myself playing the role of ballast. I'm ballast to this wave of information and focus on things that are important to a point. So when we started this series, we talked about the idea of having hope, right? Hope is having an inspiring goal of a future state for your life, right? We want to have that. We need to have an inspiring goal of you're sitting there today and you have some vision of what you want your life to look like in the future that is better than it is today. You have to have that to have hope. But that's not enough. But we still have to start there. That's why we started with creating your vision. And then once you have this inspiring goal, you have to feel like you have agency, some ability to achieve this better state. And that's when we talked about using an agile structure where we're focused on taking lots of incremental actions and collecting wins. Awesome. And then repeating that so we don't get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the journey. And that's using an agile approach. That's why I think it's so critical, that act of planning, that practice. And then once we did that, we got to a feasible roadmap to achieve this future state. And then we talked about making it resilient last week so we can find pathways that we can have confidence that we can apply our agency to reach this awesome state of rocking retirement, right? Now, today, we're going to talk about what things can we do to enhance this journey. And I think that's the key distinction that I always get frustrated with is optimization is not the issue before the house. It's the journey and making sure you can get there safely. Optimization is how we enhance that journey. And I think we should keep it in that bucket. Now, it's interesting with optimization. This is when we can turn a little bit to how do we optimize the actual money rather than the outcome. And that's okay to do. We just don't want that tail to wag the dog. So when we think of optimization, we got to be careful because this can be an infinity pool of so many things that you could potentially do to enhance your journey that we don't want to get overwhelmed too quickly. So when we talk about optimization for setting up this project and starting to walk that way, we want to optimize just a few things initially. And then we'll talk at the end of this about how we work towards other things later on. So what do we want to optimize at the beginning of putting it together, your retirement strategy? I think the biggest thing you can optimize is the tax management of your strategy because taxes, and Andy Panko is a great friend of the show. He has a great podcast as well. Taxes is one of those levers that you have more control over in retirement than maybe you've had in a long time. So initially what I would do is once you have this feasible plan that's resilient and you're trying to figure out how do I actually fund it, we need to gather information in this optimization phase. So we want to forecast a few things. We want to forecast over the next 5 to 8 years, what are we expecting our tax rate to be using a traditional withdrawal approach? So when we build this pie cake, traditionally we take all of our after-tax money first, monies that you have in a brokerage account or in a savings account. And then once you deplete that, then you take your tax deferred assets and then you take your tax-free assets. That's the traditional approach. Likely, if you're using online calculators or software, that is what is baked in from an assumption on the sequencing of how you take money out. So it would be good first to have an idea over the next 5 to 8 years, what will my tax bracket be and how much tax do I expect to pay given this strategy? And if you're like most people, you're going to have taxable income that's substantially less than you've had in a long time, and you may be in a lower tax bracket. So we want to forecast that to see if there's any opportunities. And then the other thing we want to forecast is, well, what are we looking at from a legacy and estate standpoint? Because we want to know where we're at within the limits of estate tax law and what our wishes are to see if there's any time bombs potentially waiting out there that we could defuse with some tactical things early on. And then the last thing from a tax perspective that I like to do is I like to forecast what will your required minimum distribution be if you do the traditional approach of depleting all of your after-tax assets and then leaving those IRAs and 401ks to continue to grow. And we've talked about that before. I use a simple method. I just assume a 5% growth rate on my IRA and 401k assets, and then calculate out what that would be at age 72, and then apply the current life tables. And I think I've had some questions on why 5%? What's the logic behind that? It's literally just a swag because I'm just trying to get an idea of what my required minimum distributions will be if I don't touch that money early. Because for those of you that, just to bring everybody, make sure we're all up to speed, when those required minimum distributions happen, you're going to be forced to take money out of your IRA, and that's going to become taxable income. So if you have a lot of tax-deferred assets, but you don't touch it, and you use all your after-tax assets, and these assets grow and grow and grow, you could get into a position, although you're saving taxes early in life, that at age 72 and then going forward, you're forced to take out potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars, which will be taxable income just like you earned it in work, whether you need the money or not. And that could easily move you up a tax bracket later in life, which could cause all sorts of tax issues later. So we want to know that. And once you have these forecasted, then you can determine your withdrawal strategy. You can say, should I start to do some strategic withdrawals from my IRA or my 401k to take advantage of years where I have very low income? So let's look at a quick example. Let's assume in year 2 of retirement, you're not working. You maybe got $20,000 in miscellaneous income from various sources, and you're not worried about healthcare as far as subsidies, and you need $100,000. So you're sitting in a year where you're going to have $20,000 of income and you're married. Well, then you're going to be in a very low tax bracket. And so if you only have $20,000 in income, but you need $100,000 to live, you're going to have to figure out, where do I get that other $80,000? You could take that potentially from cash savings or after-tax brokerage accounts. But the other thing you could do is you could take some of that money from your 401k or your IRA and use that money to pay for life. And you're like, well, why would I do that? I'd have to pay money on the withdrawals from my IRA. Why don't I just keep deferring taxes? Well, you might choose to say, well, yeah, I'm going to pay taxes on it, but I have such low income that if I can figure out how much can I take out and still be in the low tax bracket, let's say the 12% tax bracket. And so why not strategically take money out and just pay 12% on the money now, than potentially having to let it grow and pay more money when I get to required minimum distributions, where I might be in a higher tax bracket because of all these forced distributions that I have to take. And that's the kind of things that we want to think about and determine in this optimization phase, right? And it's important, I think, to remind ourselves when we think about tax management, it's not about avoiding tax. It's really proactively determining the time when I want to pay the tax. Like this 401k or IRA distribution, if you don't take money out in this year where you know you could pay, say, 12% because of your income, you'll be forced to take out via required minimum distributions money later on, and we don't know what the tax brackets will be. It could potentially be a higher tax rate later on. So it's sort of one of those bird in the hand. Do I maybe get 2 in the bush where I'm in a lower tax bracket? We want to think through this, because perhaps you're going to fill up your tax brackets, and that's why you want to become familiar with what those brackets are, so you can be a little bit more optimized in your withdrawal strategy. Also, this is when you're going to want to determine your Roth conversion strategy, because perhaps you don't take the money out and spend it, but you do systematic Roth conversions year after year, rather than use the money to potentially fund your life. But we can't know any of this, so we're not going to have enough information unless we do this multi-year estimate on your income and understand what realized income we're thinking you're going to have, so we can model this out. That's why you want to do 5 to 8 years, so you can see what this looks like. To add another layer on top of this, just for fun, before Medicare, this is when we're going to want to decide, should I try to get ACA or the Affordable Care Act healthcare subsidies? You'll want to determine this in your optimization phase so you can decide, is what's worth more to me? I'm having this conversation, I think, next week. Is it worth more to me to do a Roth conversion or get ACA subsidies and pay less on my healthcare this year? So this is when you want to think through that as well. And I have some cases where we're focused on getting ACA subsidies and keeping our income really, really low. And I have other cases where we're going to do Roth conversions more aggressively and pay more for healthcare because it makes sense in that case. So you can see how this is a multi-factor issue that we're dealing with. So you can't think about Roth conversions by themselves or your withdrawal strategy by themselves or your healthcare strategy by themselves because they all interact. And that's where it gets a little confusing, right? It gets a little intimidating. And that's okay because you won't figure it out. You won't figure it out and make the quote unquote right decision, the optimal decision. You just can't because there's too many unknowns. But what you can do is think through it logically in this phase. And that's the point of this phase, and get to a judgment call. And the nice thing about that judgment call is that it ends up being a year-by-year judgment call because whatever strategy you say you're going to do from a withdrawal standpoint, you can revisit this every single year based on what your vision is for your life and how that's evolved, how your assets have evolved, et cetera. So typically you're not locking yourself into a particular pathway. You still have the ability to be agile. So that's good to know. Also in this optimization phase is when we're going to look at Social Security. Because up till now in the feasible and resilient phase, we've been essentially assuming that a full retirement age is when you're going to take it. This is why we didn't want to go too deep in those phases, is because we knew we were going to try to optimize Social Security, but we wanted to put it in its proper place. And that would go, say, with pension decisions and what pension payout you get and timing of that, et cetera. Now you can see how some of these things always sort of float in between things, but we still want to have an organized way that we can come back to so we don't just get ourselves all tied up into a knot and thinking through things too much before we should. And so once we have our withdrawal strategy and then our benefit strategy, then we can revise our pie cake structure. Remember that from last week where we talked about all of our assets are going to be divided between contingency, which is an emergency fund, a floor, which is to pay for life over the near term, upside, as well as longevity, guaranteed income sources. Now that we know how much money we're going to take from each account and we factored in taxes and Social Security and ACA credits, now we can revise our pie cake and say, this is the purpose of each one of our assets, and then create an implementation plan. From what account do we take money? In what sequence are we planning to do it? How do we establish a paycheck? And then we can set up our little conversation schedule. So that you can create an implementation plan once you finish this. Let's take a breath here. You can see how you can get yourself tied up in knots. That's why process and practice is so important. Okay, cleansing breath. So now we should have an implementation plan. Now we can go look at your assets and look at how your assets are allocated now, look at the plan that you've created, and then start that reconciliation process of how do I make what is look more like what should be. We do that at the end rather than the beginning of looking at what you have from an individual investment standpoint at the beginning, because if you do it at the beginning, you get bogged down too early and you start to narrow your vision. So at this point, we should have a retirement strategy that is focused on where you're going and one that you've thought through in an organized way. Now we can look at your portfolios and say, oh, but this is what I had that I built up over the years. How do I reconcile those two so it can focus on where I'm going? And that can get a little messy too, but that's not a conversation for today. And so that's the optimization stage. Now, there are a lot of other things that you can optimize, but those are going to be picked up in the iteration or in those little conversations that you set up for yourself. And we'll talk about those in a second. So all of this gets memorialized in a retirement policy statement, ideally, which is essentially an abstract, a summary of all these decisions you made. We've talked about that and people have asked for templates. We're working on a template that we can share publicly. And so we'll have more on this later, but the key is you want to have some log of all your decisions and some context as to why you made the decisions That's pretty important because what's going to happen is once you get through all the implementation and you go off and actually rock retirement, which is the point, and you're traveling and you're playing with grandkids or you're cycling or you're doing whatever is your jam, it's easy to forget the organized thinking that you did or just lose track of it. So you want to memorialize it in some way. And so when you can come back, you can say, these are the decisions I made. And here's the context as to why I made them. So you can bring that back up to top of mind. And that's going to be really helpful when you're really scared because of inflation or the markets, or you're really excited about some new thing that you want to go do. This will bring you back and give you a framework to see how it fits and slow you down so you don't react too quickly and change direction. All right. Now let's talk for a moment about the little conversation. What does that look like after you've done all of this? And then we'll get to some listener questions. So a good framework or agenda for a little conversation to review all this, which I would say at minimum twice a year. Most of the time, twice a year is enough if you've done all this and got it all implemented, is you want to confirm, is this still where I want to go? Has my vision evolved? And what has changed from a financial resource perspective? And then update as needed and realign things, create a little action plan to realign things if you need to. But then you want to brainstorm what risks are out there that I haven't addressed yet. What opportunities are out there that I haven't addressed yet or may not have arisen until now, and then choose one or two that you think have the most impact or most important to you at the moment, and then set action items to focus on that one or two risk or opportunities to actually take progress on. And then that becomes the sprint, the little thing that you do in between. That way you don't have to go through the exhaustive list of all of the optimization things like qualified charitable distributions, etc. You can take them one little bit at a time. So that, my friend, is for the entire month, I think a good summary of the fundamentals that you want to work on understanding and practicing so you can master it to some level. And if you do that, other than those little conversations, you can feel that you have an inspiring goal for the future, that you have agency, and you have pathways to apply that agency by making organized decisions. And that's going to allow you the confidence to go rock life in between those little conversations. So with that, let's get to some listener questions. Now, next month, we are focusing 100% on listener questions, and we'll probably have some little deep dives here and there. But let's go. Let me find my list here. Our first question is from John. John says, "Hey, Roger, I'm a regular listener, and I always recommend your podcast to others." That's awesome, John. Thanks. "I just downloaded and used your net worth tool. I've always questioned the purpose on adding the house value versus the mortgage, as it seems to overinflate my net worth, even though it's not really a tangible asset I have available, unless I were to sell it or replace it. Just looking for your thoughts on this." Well, that's a great point, John. And I think the house is what we would define as a use asset, right? Your main return on it until you sell it is the joy of it, right? Just like a car would be a use asset. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of putting the value of a car on a net worth statement or the value of, say, my personal property, unless it's like jewelry or something that has tangible value. So as a car, as an example, I don't have cars on my net worth statement. At times when I've had, say, a car loan, then if the car loan was $20,000, I would put the value of the car at $20,000 just so they offset each other until the loan was retired, and then I'd just take the car off. With the house, I see your point of it can inflate your net worth, but a net worth is not what you're going to do the retirement planning on. Like if you've listened to this episode, John, or not this episode, but this entire series, you'll notice when we're working on what is a feasible retirement plan, we're focused on financial assets, things that do have, that are tools in the toolbox. The house is one of those assets that sort of sits in the garage next to the toolbox, but it's not something you can actually use until you sell it or do a HELOC or do a reverse mortgage, etc. So when you're actually doing your retirement planning, John, you would just look at the financial capital. And the only way you might factor in the house is if you are going to sell it and maybe trade down at some period in the future. But I think it's still valuable to be on the net worth statement because it is an asset, right? I mean, it goes up and down in value like everything else. It's a use asset. What I wouldn't put on there are the true use assets, boats, RVs. And if they were included, I would really discount the value to those. And I wouldn't personal property. So hopefully that helps give you some perspective. All right. Our next question comes from Joe. Hey, Joe. Love your show. I continue to be grateful for the collective dedication to the patrons of your podcast. I consume a variety of shows and all of the programs. Yours is one that I think to myself, if I were to have a podcast, I would take that approach and demeanor. Well, cool. That's great. Thanks, Joe. His question. During the most recent episode in the discussion of inflation, you described the importance of picking a method or assumptions and sticking with it. Without going into a lengthy discussion, how about the strategic assumption of no inflation and at the same time assuming no COLA for one's pension and Social Security and very low or no growth from one's financial capital? I've never seen this discussed and I've always wondered why. I would like to think that it would be very conservative by using this approach. Well, Joe, I get your point, right? If you neutralized inflation, right, because you have Social Security that would increase by inflation and your assets, you say, I'm going to have no inflation factored in anywhere, and that sort of washes everything out, and I'm also going to have no growth on my assets. The one wrinkle in there is the fact is we will have inflation on our spending. So your $100,000 that you're spending today is going to have to inflate to cover the natural tide of increasing costs, which we've seen. I think that's pretty much a constant. But taking your point, I think this is part of the household balance sheet of not trying to look at return on investment in terms of growing our assets. So you could actually use the household balance sheet where you would still apply inflation to the spending, but you could apply no inflation to any of your income sources, pension, Social Security, etc., and assume zero growth on any of your assets. You could do that within the household balance sheet, and I think that would be a really conservative approach. And then you could play around with what inflation number you used on your spending and even putting that at zero if you wanted to. I'd be careful there because that's one that definitely is going to be impactful to us. But I think that is what you're talking about on a higher level is the approach of the household balance sheet, which is to bring everything back to today's dollars and not forecast forward based on assumed returns. So you could play around with the assumptions in there, but I think what you're proposing could just be a quick check, but there's going to be some added complexity that's probably worth the effort. All right, our next question comes from Joan, and Joan gave me one of my favorite things. Thank you, Joan, a audio question. So let's go to that.
Roger, I have a Social Security timing question. Other than the small monthly increase in benefits, is there any reason to wait until full retirement age of 66 and 4 months rather than collecting Social Security at 66 and 2 months? My birth date is November of 1956, so full retirement age would be 66 and 4 months. My spouse is older and is already collecting Social Security. So I'm wondering whether it's important to wait the extra 2 months just to hit that magic full retirement age. Thanks for answering my question. Bye.
Well, great question, Joan. You're right. The implications of taking Social Security only 2 months before full retirement age from a perspective of the reduction in value, it's really small. It's like 0.05% for each of those 2 months, or 98.9% of your full retirement age benefit. Then, of course, there's your future COLA adjustments, which is probably too small to even think about. If you had a bigger time frame, it definitely would be something that would be more concerning from a reduction of benefits. For example, if you're doing it 3 years before full retirement age, but a couple months isn't going to make a huge difference. So a couple additional things you might think about is one is if you still have health care and you're not on Medicare yet, and it's a high deductible plan through an employer, you might miss 2 months of HSA contributions, and your cash flow from Social Security might be a little bumpy, and that will smooth itself out pretty quickly. So I don't think it is a big deal, Joan. So hopefully that helps. Our next question is really a comment. Lori, this is from Lori. Hey, Roger, started listening to your podcast several months ago, and I'm really enjoying the content and you as a host. Well, cool. And she was interested in the series we did recently on inflation. And she had an observation. It says, perhaps because I am not a high net worth individual, I'm keenly aware of the price of groceries and the cost of gas. However, most people have a general idea of the price of a gallon of gas, which brings me to the reason for sending you this quick note. Your last podcast, you're recapping the definition of inflation, and you said the gas that you used to pay 50 cents for now is $2 to $3 a gallon. To appeal to all of your listeners, both high and low net worth, why not brush up on what the cost of a gallon of gas is when you use an example of inflation? I'm guessing she thought I was way off. At least you admitted you didn't know the price of a candy bar, but to casually say gas is between $2 and $3 shows you're not on top of current prices. A quick Google search would show what it is. Thanks for reading my feedback. And she lives in California, where the gas at the time of this writing was $4.69 a gallon. I was just in San Francisco last week, or 2 weeks ago now. Yeah, and it was like a lot higher than that. And I think that's the issue here, Lori, is one, we record these sometimes ahead of schedule, often ahead of schedule if I have my act together. And gas prices have been pretty volatile. And at the time I record this, gas in Texas was between $2 and $3 a gallon. I think it broke the $3 mark in February of this year. So that was my daily reality. So I am fairly familiar with the price of gas because I do fill up. So I think it had a factor of when I recorded it and the fact that I live in Texas, where gas prices are a lot less expensive where you live. And so I was speaking my reality, but I get your point. I don't know if it detracts from the larger point of understanding the concept of things, which is anything I talk about, we're always going to want to apply to your own reality, right? And oftentimes when I answer questions or work on things, just a little backstory, Lori, my goal is, and I'm not going to say I always hit it, is to help give a framework to think on an issue or work through an issue that you can use and apply to your own reality. Because your own reality with gas prices is very different than mine. And I respect that and I get that. But thank you for the message. And I took it as constructive criticism, as I have chosen to read everything I get via email. And really, when I'm having conversations, it's actually been one of the best decisions I've made in my life is I read everything and I try to hear everything as if everybody writing it has that pleasant voice and the best intent to help me be better. Whether they do or not, I'm guessing you do, but whether they do or not, I tell you that has changed my life and taken so much frustration out of it. So thanks, Lori. I'm glad that you are enjoying the show. Our next question comment comes from Mo. And Mo, I think you're a pretty good friend of the show. We've interacted a few times and you've sent a number of questions, so I appreciate that. So Mo wanted to make a point about Roth conversions. So Mo's point is most financial podcasters, planners, advisors provide caveats and disclaimers regarding investing. For example, stocks can go up and down, you can lose the value of your money, etc. But rarely do you hear any caveats regarding Roth conversions, which are not the most optimal strategy in many cases. Just as markets can fluctuate, predicting tax rates is a fool's game. If one had converted a 6 or 7 figure sum 5 years ago, the tax bill would have been 3 to 4% higher than converting now. Again, it could be higher or lower 5 years from now. Roth conversions are being touted without disclaimers, which is dangerous. Mo, I would say you are 100% correct. Roth conversions are one of those things that are very in vogue when we talk about the bling of financial planning. I can think of some very popular podcasters and experts that are very convicted that you need to convert everything now, or if you're not doing Roth conversions, you're crazy. I don't like that kind of thinking. I don't like thinking in absolutes because nobody knows how this stuff works out. There is no absolute answer. And there are a lot of factors that can change, whether it's tax policy, like you're talking about, or life circumstances, or vision of how you're going to withdraw money. There's a lot of factors that are very fluid. And so anybody saying that, yes, you need to do this for sure, and they're speaking to everybody, is either marketing, selling, ignorant, or doesn't appreciate the fluidity of things. And that's one reason when we've talked about Roth conversions, it is you want to think about them in an organized way. And at best, you're going to get to a judgment of what you should do. And if you choose to do significant Roth conversions, you just at least want to do that, understanding the fluidity of all of this stuff and just feeling you made the best decision. Andy Panko and I had a good chat about this. I think it was episode 402, Retirement Tax Management, the Tax Toolbox. This answer is going to be different for everybody, I think is what Andy said. And also, the answer is going to really be a judgment. And so I appreciate that perspective because it's so easy to talk in absolutes when there isn't a lot of absolutes in what we're doing here and what you're doing in creating your strategy. So I appreciate that perspective, and I agree with you.
Hey, Roger, this is John. It is January 1st of 2022. I am going to be retiring on January 4th of 2022. I will turn 65 in September of 2022. I am not taking Social Security, and my income level in 2022 will be much, much less than it has been in the previous years. So I want to make sure that Medicare knows that my income level's gone down. And apparently there is an appeal form that I need to submit. But at what point do I tell them all of this so that my expenses for Medicare are relative to my 2022 income level, not 2 years ago? Thanks.
Well, hey, John, thanks for the question and congratulations on your retirement. As you can see, this was submitted in January and we're just now getting to it. That's one reason why next month we're focusing on listener questions because we hate answering them late. And we try to get to as many of them as we can. So I appreciate your patience and hopefully this is still helpful. So John wants to know, how does he report his decreased income to Medicare now that he's retired and he's getting ready to apply for Medicare? And the reason John cares about this is because they have what they're called IRMA surcharges. So if you make too much money, you will pay more for Medicare Part B and Part D. And that's what's called an IRMA surcharge. And John's coming out of a career, and it sounds like he has income that would cause this IRMA to surcharge to take impact. Well, the good thing when you retire is that there are 7 life-changing events that affect your modified adjusted gross income that you are eligible for a reconsideration to take this IRMA surcharge away. And that's what John is talking about. Stoppage of work, like retirement, is one of them. And there is a form that you have to fill out. Or you could call the 800 number. That might be better because with COVID, it can be a little hard to get in. But here would be the sequence of events, John, that you want to go through. Sign up for Medicare as normal. Do that about 6 months before you need it. In this case, about 3 months before age 65. Then after you've enrolled in Medicare, John, you're going to receive a document. This is called an IRMA determination notice. And you want to save this document because it's important to keep for the process that you're going to go through. And the initial threshold for IRMA surcharges is $182,000 modified adjusted gross income if you're married, or about $91,000 if you're single. So if your income was below this prior to retirement, then you really don't have to worry about this, but you're still going to get this determination letter. And note, if you're applying for Medicare this year in 2022, what the IRS is going to use, or Medicare is going to use, is they're going to use your tax return from 2020. So there's always this 2-year lag of the tax return that they're going to look at in order to determine whether or not you're going to be subject to this IRMA surcharge. Once you have this letter and you look at the initial determination, you can request a reconsideration either by calling the Social Security Administration or by writing to them using form SSA-44. And you Google that, ssa.gov, SSA-44. And you want to do this promptly because you will be paying the amount that they say until you get the determination as to whether you qualify for one of these life-saving events. So after your determination letter comes in, you want to write this letter and use SSA-44 to say, hey, I qualify. I just retired. So the numbers you're using are wrong. You're going to send that in. You're going to pay the IRMA surcharge while it's being reviewed. And then assuming that they say, oh yeah, you retired. No big deal. We'll take it away. Any overage will be credited to you for future Medicare payments. It's interesting that IRMA isn't actually paid to Medicare Part B and Part D plan provider. It's withheld from your Social Security check. So you'll have some reconciliation once you go through this process. And we'll have a couple forms that we'll share within 6-Shot Saturday or websites that can go more into this process. So hopefully that helps you out and we caught you where it's still relevant. And if not, hopefully it helps someone else. So I appreciate you. With that said, let's go set a SMART sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And you're off to set a little baby step you can take to not just rock retirement, but rock life. Sort of the same thing, right? So in the next 7 days, if you found this series helpful, I would suggest you take a piece of paper and you map out a process. You can map out the process as I described it, or you could map out the process as I described it and adjust it to your own needs. And regardless of whether you're retired, whether you're about to retire, wherever you're at, I would encourage you to consider start walking through your strategy in this organized way with fresh eyes so you can look for incongruencies and gain more agency and power and confidence. Because if you get this strategy in place, worrying about inflation, worried about markets becomes much more manageable because you feel like I have a plan and I have a system to continually iterate on it to know that as life unfolds, I'm going to keep my hand on the wheel. I'm actually recording this on a Friday, and it is absolutely beautiful. It is a high of 82 today, very light and moderate winds. I'm taking half of the day to go play golf with my wife on this Friday. I hope it is beautiful where you are, and I hope you have a great week. Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.